The Flannan Isles rise from the North Atlantic like ancient, jagged teeth. They are a remote and unforgiving cluster of rocks, located some 20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. For centuries, sailors have given them a wide berth, their Gaelic name, Na H. Eilenan Flannach, whispered with a mixture of respect and fear. These are not gentle, welcoming lands. They are stark, wind-scarred sentinels battered by the relentless fury of the ocean. Their cliffs plunge dramatically into churning grey waters, and the air itself seems heavy with the weight of isolation. It is a place where nature reigns supreme, a kingdom of stone, sea and sky, where human presence feels like a temporary intrusion, a fleeting and fragile trespass upon a world that was never meant to be inhabited. The largest of these islands, Eilean Mor, holds a particular mystique. Long before any structure was built there, it was known as a place of strange power. Shepherds from the mainland would bring their flocks to graze on its surprisingly lush grass, but they never dared to spend the night. They spoke of an invisible presence, of ancient spirits that guarded the island with a jealous and watchful eye. There were rules, unspoken but deeply understood, that one must follow when setting foot on Eilean Mor. To break them was to invite a terrible fate. It was upon this eerie, myth-laden rock that the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to erect a beacon of civilization, a lighthouse to guide ships through the treacherous waters. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was a marvel of Victorian engineering, completed in 1899. Standing 75 feet tall, its powerful lamp was designed to cut through the thickest fog and the darkest night, a symbol of man's determination to conquer the wildness of the sea. Yet the lighthouse itself seemed to absorb the island's isolation rather than dispel it. Its construction was a monumental effort against the harsh elements, and its operation required men of a particular fortitude. 3 keepers were stationed there at all times, living in a rotation that ensured the light never went out. They were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett and Donald MacArthur. Men accustomed to the lonely life of the sea, yet perhaps unprepared for the profound solitude of Eilean Mor. Their world was a tiny, self-contained universe, circumscribed by the circular walls of the tower and the rocky coastline of the island. The only connection to the outside world was the relief ship, the Hesperus, which brought supplies, mail and a fresh keeper every few weeks. Between these visits, the men were utterly alone. Their only companions, the shrieking gulls and the eternal roar of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. This was the setting for a mystery that would begin just 1 year after the light was first lit. It was a drama played out on a stage of extreme isolation, where the line between the natural world and the supernatural had always been perilously thin, and where 3 experienced men were about to vanish without a trace. On December 15th, 1900, the steamer Arctur passed the Flannan Isles on its voyage to Leith. Its captain noted with concern that the powerful light on Eilean Mor was not lit. This was a serious breach of protocol, a troubling sign from a station known for its meticulous service. A report was filed upon the ship's arrival, but due to severe weather, no immediate action could be taken. The true alarm was not raised until the scheduled arrival of the relief vessel, the Hesperus. The ship, captained by James Harvey, was meant to make its routine stop on December 20th, but was delayed by the same fierce storms that had been lashing the Scottish coast. It was not until Boxing Day, December 26th, that the seas calmed enough for the Hesperus to finally approach the island. As the Hesperus neared Eilean Mor, a sense of unease settled over the crew. The day was unusually calm and clear, the water like glass after the recent gales. Yet the island itself was disturbingly quiet. There was no flag flying from the mast, a standard greeting for the approaching relief ship. No one was waiting on the landing stage to catch the ropes and help unload the supplies. The lighthouse tower stood silent and impassive against the pale winter sky. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's horn, its loud blast echoing across the rocks and water, a sound that should have brought the keepers running. But there was no response. Only the cries of the seabirds answered their call. The relief keeper, Joseph Moore, who was aboard the Hesperus to begin his next shift, felt a growing dread. He knew the men on the island, Marshall, Duckett and MacArthur. They were seasoned professionals, not men to neglect their duties or ignore the arrival of the supply boat. The silence from the shore was more than just unusual. It was deeply unsettling. Every routine signal went unanswered. Captain Harvey, his patience wearing thin and his concern mounting, decided he could wait no longer. He ordered a small boat to be lowered to take Joseph Moore ashore. The mystery of the silent island had to be solved, and Moore was the one who would have to confront it first. As Moore was rowed towards the western landing stage, the eerie stillness of the place became even more pronounced. The landing platform, usually a scene of bustling activity, was empty. The ropes and crane used to hoist supplies up the steep cliff path were all neatly secured, but there were signs of recent storm damage. A supply box had been smashed, its contents strewn across the concrete. This was not entirely surprising given the recent weather, but it did little to ease Moore's growing anxiety. He began the long, arduous climb up the steep steps cut into the rock face, his heart pounding with a mixture of exertion and fear. Each step took him closer to the lighthouse and closer to an answer he was beginning to suspect he did not want to find. Upon reaching the top of the cliff, Joseph Moore found the entrance gate to the lighthouse compound closed, as was the main door to the living quarters. This was standard procedure, a necessary precaution against the fierce winds. However, what he discovered inside plunged the situation from mere concern into profound mystery. The main door was unlocked. This was the first detail that struck him as deeply wrong. The keepers were meticulous about security, and an unlocked door was a glaring violation of their own rules. Pushing it open, he stepped into a silence that felt heavy and unnatural. The air inside was cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. It was the cold of an abandoned place. The scene within the keeper's living quarters was a tableau of interrupted life. In the kitchen, a half-eaten meal of salted mutton and pickles sat on the table, cold and untouched. It was as if the men had been in the middle of their dinner when something had suddenly and urgently called them away. An overturned chair lay on the floor, suggesting a hasty departure, a sudden leap to action. This single detail spoke volumes, painting a picture of abrupt panic or an immediate unforeseen emergency that required all hands at once. The domestic tranquility of the scene was shattered by this one piece of displaced furniture, a silent witness to a moment of crisis. Moore continued his search, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. He found the keepers' beds unmade, as if they had just risen for the day's duties. Their oilskin coats, the heavy waterproof gear essential for venturing outside in Hebridean weather, were gone. This suggested the men had left the lighthouse together and had expected to face the elements. But why? And where had they gone? He climbed the winding stairs to the lamp room at the very top of the tower. Everything there was in pristine order. The lamp was clean and refilled with oil, ready to be lit at dusk. The magnificent lenses were polished to a shine. The wicks had been trimmed. But the lamp was cold and extinguished. The final chilling discovery was the clock on the kitchen wall. It had stopped. This small, mundane detail added to the overwhelming sense of a place frozen in time, a narrative that had abruptly ceased without a final chapter. Moore, now thoroughly shaken, retreated from the silent lighthouse and returned to the landing stage to signal the Hesperus. He had found no men, no bodies, and no clear sign of what had transpired. He had only found a collection of baffling clues, an unfinished meal, an overturned chair, missing coats, and a profound, deafening silence. The Flannan Isles lighthouse had been abandoned, and its 3 keepers had vanished from the face of the earth. Once Captain Harvey and other crew members came ashore, a more thorough search of the lighthouse was conducted. It was during this search that they found the lighthouse logbook, the official record of operations and daily life on Eileen Moor. The initial entries were routine, detailing weather conditions, lamp maintenance, and other mundane duties. However, the entries for the days leading up to the disappearance told a different, far more disturbing story. They were written by Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and they painted a picture of men gripped by an unexplainable and escalating fear. The first strange entry was dated December 12th, and it spoke of a storm, the likes of which Marshall, a man of the sea, had never witnessed. Marshall wrote of severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen in 20 years. He described the principal keeper, James Ducat, as being very quiet, and the third assistant, Donald MacArthur, as crying. This was a shocking revelation. MacArthur was known as a tough, brawling sailor, a veteran of the sea who was not easily intimidated. For him to be reduced to tears was almost unbelievable. The log spoke of the men huddling together, praying as the storm raged outside, battering their stone fortress. The terror in Marshall's words was palpable, a raw account of 3 strong men feeling utterly helpless against a force of unimaginable power. It was a storm that seemed to attack not just the lighthouse, but their very souls. The next entry, on December 13th, continued the narrative of fear. The storm still raged, and the men were unable to venture outside. Marshall wrote again of their prayers, noting that they were all praying for the tempest to end. The tone suggested that this was no ordinary weather event, it was something more, something that felt personal and malevolent. It was as if the island itself or some entity upon it was trying to break them. The log conveyed a sense of psychological siege, where the relentless howling of the wind and the crashing of the waves were amplified by their complete and total isolation from the rest of the world, trapping them with their mounting terror. The final entry was made on December 15th. It read simply, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." After this, the logbook was silent. The slate for recording notes before they were formally entered into the log was also found, with the last scribbled entry for 9 a.m. on the 15th noting some routine duties. After that, nothing. The men had simply ceased to record their existence. The logbook entries provided a timeline of terror, a window into the keeper's final days. They described a horrific storm and a state of intense fear. Yet, this terrifying account would soon be contradicted by a stark and baffling reality, deepening the mystery of what truly happened on Eileen Moor. The logbook's account of a monstrous storm seemed at first to offer a plausible explanation for the men's disappearance. It painted a vivid picture of a terrifying event that could have led to a tragic accident. However, this theory began to crumble almost immediately. When the Hesperus returned to the mainland, inquiries were made with other sources. The Scottish mainland, just 20 miles away, had experienced no such storm on December 12th, 13th or 14th. Weather reports from the surrounding area, including from the lighthouse at the butt of Lewis, showed that the weather during that period had been rough, but by no means extraordinary. There was no record of the severe winds that Thomas Marshall had so fearfully described. This contradiction was the central, baffling heart of the Flannan Isles mystery. How could three experienced lighthouse keepers, men who understood the sea better than anyone, record a devastating storm that apparently never happened? The discrepancy was inexplicable. It suggested that the terror described in the log was not caused by a meteorological event, but by something else entirely. Perhaps the storm was a metaphor for a psychological breakdown, or perhaps it was a localized, freakish phenomenon that defied all scientific explanation. The absence of any corroborating evidence for the storm only made the men's disappearance more ghostly and strange. The official inquiry, led by Robert Muirhead, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, was forced to grapple with this impossible puzzle. Muirhead knew the keepers personally and held them in high regard. He travelled to Eileen Moor himself to investigate the scene. He noted the damage at the western landing, where an iron railway had been twisted out of shape and a large rock weighing over a ton had been displaced. This suggested that enormous waves had indeed crashed over that part of the island, reaching a height of over 100 feet above sea level. This could have been the storm, a surge of freak waves during an otherwise calm period. But this explanation, while accounting for some of the physical evidence, did not fully align with the logbook. Why would the men describe a storm lasting for days if it was merely a single massive wave event? And why would they venture out together? The rules of the lighthouse service were strict. One keeper must always remain inside the tower. For all three men, Marshall, Duckett and MacArthur, to abandon their posts simultaneously was an unprecedented breach of protocol. It would have required a truly exceptional crisis, something so urgent that it caused them to forget the most fundamental rule of their profession in a moment of shared panic or purpose. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, the most logical and widely accepted theory was that the men had been swept away by a freak wave. The official conclusion reached by Robert Muirhead supported this idea. He speculated that on the afternoon of December 15th, after the storm had passed, two of the keepers, likely Marshall and Duckett, had gone down to the western landing stage to secure a crate of supplies that had been dislodged. The sea, though appearing calm, as noted in the log, can be treacherous. An unexpected, massive wave could have surged up the cliff face, threatening to pull them in. The third keeper, Donald MacArthur, seeing his colleagues in peril from the lighthouse, would have rushed out to help them, forgetting his coat in his haste. This scenario accounts for several key pieces of evidence. It explains the missing oilskins for two of the men, the fact that all three were gone, and the damage found at the landing stage. It presents a plausible, if tragic, narrative of an accident at sea, a sudden and violent event that claimed all three lives in an instant. The sea around the Flannans is notoriously unpredictable, and rogue waves are a known, albeit rare, maritime hazard. This explanation provided a rational, naturalistic answer to a perplexing mystery, allowing the Northern Lighthouse Board to close its official file on the matter with a finding of accidental death. It was a clean, tidy solution. However, for many, this theory felt incomplete and unsatisfying. It did not adequately explain the terrified tone of the logbook entries. Why would experienced keepers be reduced to tears by a storm, only to be careless enough to be caught by a wave after it had supposedly passed? Furthermore, why would all three men go down to the landing? Securing a supply box was a routine task that surely did not require the attention of the entire crew, especially in violation of their most sacred rule. The theory of the rogue wave, while plausible, seemed to dismiss the strange psychological elements of the case. The fear, the crying, the unlocked door, and the overturned chair. Alternative natural theories emerged over the years. One suggested that the men had been investigating a sea cave at the base of the cliffs during a low tide. These caves were known to produce loud, explosive sounds as air and water were compressed within them during a swell. Perhaps the men, hearing these thunderous noises and fearing the foundations of the lighthouse were being damaged, went to investigate and were caught by a sudden surge of water that filled the cave and drowned them. This might explain the logbook storm as a misinterpretation of these subterranean sounds, but it remains pure speculation, with no evidence to support it beyond a general knowledge of the island's geology. With the natural explanations feeling incomplete to many, darker theories began to circulate, focusing on the human element and the immense psychological pressure of life on Eileen Moore. The profound isolation, the constant noise of the wind and sea, and the claustrophobic living conditions could take a heavy toll on a person's sanity. One theory proposed that the men had not been lost to the sea, but to a sudden, violent confrontation among themselves. Perhaps an argument had escalated into a fight, resulting in murder and suicide. This could explain the overturned chair and the hasty departure from the meal. This line of thinking often focused on Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper known for his volatile temper. Could he have snapped under the strain, attacking his two companions? Perhaps he killed Marshall and Duckett in a fit of rage, dragged their bodies to the cliff edge and threw them into the sea. Then, consumed by guilt and horror at his own actions, he leaped to his own death. This murder-suicide theory provides a dramatic, self-contained solution to the mystery. It accounts for the lack of bodies and the signs of a sudden disturbance inside the lighthouse. It turns the story from one of natural disaster to one of human tragedy and madness. However, this theory also has significant weaknesses. There was no evidence of a struggle found within the lighthouse. Besides the single overturned chair, everything was in order. There were no bloodstains, no signs of a violent altercation. Furthermore, the friends and families of the keepers vehemently rejected this idea. They described the men as professionals who got along well. James Duckett was a steady family man, and Thomas Marshall was an experienced and respected keeper. While MacArthur had a reputation for being tough, there was nothing in his history to suggest he was capable of such a brutal act. The theory relied on character assassination and grim speculation rather than concrete evidence. Another psychological theory suggested a shared delusion or folie à trois, madness of three. Could the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the island have induced a collective psychosis? Perhaps the storm they described in the log was a shared hallucination, a manifestation of their internal fears. In this state of altered reality, they might have believed some terrible entity was coming for them, or that the sea itself was calling them. This could have led them to walk willingly into the ocean together, a bizarre pact driven by a shared madness. While it accounts for the strange log entries, this theory ventures deep into the realm of psychological conjecture, a fascinating but ultimately unprovable hypothesis. Beyond the rational explanations of waves and madness lie the older, darker whispers of the supernatural. The Flannan Isles have always been a place steeped in folklore, and the disappearance of the keepers quickly became woven into the fabric of local legend. For centuries, the islands were believed to be inhabited by spirits or fairies, the little people, who were fiercely protective of their domain. Some locals believed that the keepers had somehow offended these ancient entities, perhaps by disrespecting a sacred place on the island or by breaking one of the unwritten rules. Their vanishing, therefore, was not an accident but a punishment. One persistent legend tells of a giant sea serpent or some other monstrous creature from the deep rising from the waves to snatch the men from the cliffs. This taps into ancient maritime myths of krakens and leviathans, creatures that embody the terrifying and unknowable power of the ocean. In this version of the story, the men were not victims of a wave, but of a living predator. Another tale suggests they were taken by the ghosts of drowned sailors, forever haunting the treacherous waters around the islands. These stories, while fantastical, speak to a deep-seated belief that the sea is a realm with its own dark and powerful forces, which can occasionally reach out and claim the living. The eerie atmosphere of Eilean Mor itself fueled these supernatural theories. Shepherds who had used the island for grazing had long spoken of its strange aura and the need to perform rituals to appease its spirits. The very chapel on the island, supposedly built by St. Flannan in the 7th century, was said to be a place of potent energy. Could the keepers, living in constant proximity to this ancient power, have been driven mad or lured to their deaths by something otherworldly? Some have even speculated about alien abduction, pointing to the logbook's mention of strange lights as potential evidence of a vessel from another world visiting the remote outpost. While these supernatural tales are easily dismissed by modern sensibilities, they form an essential part of the Flannan Isles story. They reflect the cultural context of the Outer Hebrides at the time, a place where the line between the physical and spiritual worlds was porous. These legends capture the profound sense of mystery and awe that the event inspired. They offer an explanation that transcends the mundane, suggesting that the keepers were not just lost but taken. They became figures of folklore, their fate a cautionary tale whispered by fishermen and passed down through generations, forever entwining their names with the haunted reputation of the Isles. Today, more than a century after the disappearance of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat and Donald MacArthur, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse still stands. The light is now automated, its powerful beams sweeping across the empty sea without any human hand to guide it. The tower remains a silent monument to the 3 men who vanished from its watch. The mystery has never been solved, and it is unlikely that it ever will be. The lack of bodies, the conflicting evidence, and the passage of time have conspired to keep the truth forever hidden, locked away in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The case remains one of the greatest unsolved maritime mysteries in history. The story has inspired poems, songs, and even an opera, each attempting to capture the haunting essence of the event. The most famous is Wilfred Wilson Gibson's 1912 poem Flannan Isle, which imagines the discovery of the empty lighthouse and ends with the chilling lines, "We seem to stand for an endless while, though we know in our hearts it is sorrow's thread, a story of ruin and running to waste, and the incredible shame of the dead." The poem solidified the mystery in the public imagination, transforming it from a historical event into a piece of enduring Gothic folklore that continues to captivate and disturb us. Ultimately, the Flannan Isles mystery endures because it touches upon our most primal fears. The fear of the unknown, the fear of isolation, and the fear of nature's overwhelming power. The story forces us to confront the fragility of human existence when pitted against the vast, indifferent forces of the wild. The keepers were experienced, capable men in a fortress of stone and steel, yet they were erased from existence as if they had never been. Their story is a stark reminder that no matter how much we build and innovate, there are still places on this earth where we are merely guests and where the rules are not our own. The unanswered questions are what give the tale its power. What was the storm that Marshall described? Why did MacArthur cry? Why was the chair overturned? Why did all 3 men break their most sacred rule and leave the tower together? Every theory, from the logical to the fantastical, leaves loose ends. The rogue wave, the fight, the shared madness, the sea monster, none can fully reconcile all the strange details, And so the mystery remains, as stark and impenetrable as the cliffs of Eilean Moor. The silence that greeted the Hesperus on that cold December day in 1900 echoes still, a permanent and unsettling question mark on the maritime charts of Scotland.